So as you may know, I give tennis lessons to people all around the world through Zoom, right? We do Zoom private lessons. They send me videos of their technique. It could be their forehand, their backhand, their serve, their net play. Or we look at their strategy and their match play and we diagram their court positioning and their shot selection. It's really cool. Well, over the last 4 months, I have been helping one of my students and YouTube subscribers, James, with Zoom private lessons for his serve. And I want to highlight the improvement that James has made because it is remarkable. And this really goes with everyone. The people who are taking Zoom private lessons are improving so quickly because of the analysis and the side-by-side comparison of their technique versus Roger Federer or maybe Naomi Osaka. It's so cool to see themselves next to the pros and allow them to see what they can do in order to improve. So I want to show you James. Is his serve perfect? Absolutely not. He would be the first to tell you that. But is the improvement remarkable? Yes. He's 74 years old, lives in Florida, and he is so excited about the improvement of his serve. I think it would be really cool in the comments if you gave James a nice little thumbs up and gave him some, some congratulations on the improvement he's made. All right, let's check it out. Hello, it's Ryan from 2minutetennis.net, and in this video, I'm going to show you the remarkable serve improvement from James, one of my Zoom lesson takers. Now first, let's watch his old serve 5 times in a row, and then I'll show you his new serve 5 times in a row, and then I'll, compare the two and show you the difference. And here is the new improved service technique from James. Again, I'll show it to you 5 times in a row. When it came to James's old service motion, he was really stuck. His serve was not going to get any better. But with this new motion, the sky's the limit. And his goal is to hit a 100-mile-an-hour serve, and I'm going to help him get there. All right, so the first thing, let's look at his positioning at first. His grip. You'll notice, and this is one of the things that I teach, is you'll notice that his strings are facing in different places. So he has, at the moment, his strings facing down on the left here. This was 4 months ago. And now look at his racket. His racket is facing up slightly. That's what I teach as a way to help a student use the proper continental grip, where their base knuckle and heel pad are on panel number 2. If you're someone who currently has your strings pointing down at the beginning, it's most likely promoting a forehand grip or, Eastern grip, even a semi-Western grip, and that's not going to allow you to hit your best serves. So one of the little tricks that I've learned over the years of coaching is ask a student have their racket actually slightly open. And really the easiest way to do that without having like a severe wrist curl at the beginning of your serve is actually to have the proper grip. So to use the correct grip, have your racket face slightly open on your serve. Here's the next thing that we talked about. And it was about lowering his toss. I'm going to show you his new toss first. What I like to do is I like to stop the video, and this is what I do during my Zoom lessons. Like, James, or anybody, I give about a dozen Zoom lessons a week to people all around the world. And when I do a live Zoom lesson, they see my screen just like you are. And they're asking me questions, and I'm showing them, the old and the new and the pros. It's so cool. And one of the things I show students is when the ball gets to the top of the head, I like to start a timer. And what I like is that the ball from here until they hit the ball is between 0.55 and 0.9 seconds. So let's see where James is here. So he released the ball, and you can see as soon as it gets to that green line, that's when the timer starts. And he hits the ball right there. So he's at 0.89. So he's within that range of acceptability. Any lower, and really the toss is too low. Any higher than 0.9, and really the toss is too high. So now let's do the old swing. And we got it here at the top of his head. So we're going to start the timer here. And we're going to see how long that ball is in the air. Now, isn't it interesting? He's already at 0.9 seconds and he's just still in the racket drop. So now he hits the ball and he's at 1.06. What this means is with his newer serve, he has a lower toss. And if you have a lower toss, that's good because it gives him less time to swing. And if you've ever had very little time to get to work or to get to school or get to the dentist, what do you have to do? You got to go fast. So by lowering his toss, he's actually creating the environment for racket speed. You don't want a lot of time to swing. You want less time to swing because that promotes you swinging faster. So by doing that and giving him a lower toss, he actually helps make his swing more efficient and actually allows him to swing faster and meet the ball and time the ball correctly. All right, here's the next thing I want to show you. I'm just going to go in order here. And each thing that we talk about might affect something later, which you'll see when it comes to the contact and that toss. So I want to show you this position right here between the old and the new. Let's make it right here. I want you to notice this curl. Shout out to Jim Klein, Doylestown Tennis Club. He calls this the goose, where your right wrist, if you're right-handed, as you lift the racket up, it's slightly curled. This helps, a ball sit in the throat of the racket, strings are facing down, and then it makes it easy to knock the party hat off the head. You can see on this side how the racket tip is actually pointing up, where here, the tip of his racket is pointing, let me get the right color, the tip of the racket is pointing down. So as you lift the racket up with your strings facing down, try to have a little curl in the wrist, and that actually keeps the tip of the racket below your hand. You can see here the tip of his racket is above his hand, and that produces an open racket. And you can see how he goes into this wrist extension, where his wrist is now laid back. And when you get into a laid back wrist, that's the waiter's tray, and then all of a sudden the strings are facing up. You can see as he's doing this now where his strings are facing down, watch his racket come perfectly in over the head. And yes, he did a lot of serves. I would say he probably hit 5,000 serves with a birthday hat on his head, learning to knock the birthday hat off his head. That way he can have 360 degrees of rotation of the racket circling around his head rather than the racket just flopping open, which is that waiter's tray serve. You're not going to swing your fastest just laying the racket open into the waiter's tray, but rather you want to do what Federer does and what Naomi Osaka does, where the racket actually passes in over the head and the swing is a little more lasso-like a cowboy with a lasso on a horse, right? So that movement of bringing the racket in over the head from that curled wrist position, again, while he's doing this, he could hold a ball in the throat of his racket. You can see the ball could still be in the throat of the racket. You don't have to be this curled, but to be in this position, starting from this position is absolutely remarkable. It's a little bit of an exaggeration what he's doing, but it's absolutely getting him on the right track to having a much, much better serve. All right. This is an absolutely remarkable improvement that he's got right here. And again, are there things that he isn't doing at the moment? Of course. Could he use his legs more? Yes. Could he, use his left arm slightly differently? Of course. He doesn't yet have the Roger Federer service motion, but we're working on it. But I just want to highlight the improvements. I want you to notice this position and this position right here. His racket is facing in completely different directions. His racket here is facing up to the left. Believe it or not, here his strings are facing down. What I asked him to do was practice hitting serves with the back of his racket. This is a little trick to fool the brain into not going palm up. The strings that he's going to use are actually facing down, and his strings are facing the ground, and then watch his racket come around, and now his strings are facing like this, and now his racket is perfectly on edge, and now his racket's like this, and then his racket's rotating, now his strings are here, and now he's into the back of the ball. So he has rotated his racket in order to make contact, rather than being palm up on the left side in that waiter's tray and hitting just perfectly flat into the back with no pronation. He actually learned how to bring his racket around with the strings closed. You can see this. His strings are facing down. His strings are facing down. They're facing down. They're facing down. Now, is this an exaggeration? Absolutely. Sometimes in learning what to do, and how to improve your technique, you have to make an exaggeration, which is completely on the other end of the spectrum of what he normally does. And you can see that on the before 4 months ago, strings are facing up. Here, his strings are facing down. So again, that's completely on the other end of the spectrum. Will this start to soften a little bit as he goes and he doesn't have to be so extreme? Absolutely. He'll loosen up. But again, he's just learning how to do this. His racket is now on edge. And then we get to the contact. Now, this is what is so cool about using the lower toss and the correct technique on the racket. First off, we can see his arm is a lot more bent on this one, and the racket is to the outside of his hand. Here, he's absolutely reaching higher. And notice the racket is on the inside of his hand. So let me explain what that means. If we draw from his elbow to his hand and we draw a straight line, you can see that the racket, if I draw his racket, is to the outside of that line. If I draw on the new from his elbow to his hand, and then we draw his racket, it's on the inside of his hand. Here, the racket is on the outside. You want the racket on the inside of the hand, and that's the fastest way to pronate the racket. So he is learning how to pronate with his racket the way the pros have it, where the arm is this way and the racket's at this angle. Where on the old, I can still remember our very first lesson with him talking about this back in October, where his racket was on the outside of his hand. He's just not going to be able to serve his absolute fastest, 6 months from now, a year from now. As I mentioned, this serve was as good as it could get. It can't get any better without changing what he does. And this serve completely knew the sky is the limit for James and his service motion. And then that racket, because he was pronating, and we see his racket closed here, and then his racket's on edge and then turns, look how his racket actually pronates. So now his strings are actually facing off to the right. Where if we look at his old swing, after contact, his strings are facing to the left. And then look at this frame right there. We can see where his racket is. His racket's like this with his strings facing down. So a remarkable difference in what he is doing from the old and new. And I just wanted to share with you and highlight the amazing improvement that James has made. All right, make sure that you're going below in the comments and congratulating James. But let me show you in front of the camera what this looks like. Now, before I share with you the drills and techniques I wanted James to use in order to make those remarkable changes in his technique, I want to kind of give you a little backstory here. So this morning, James sends me an email, which he has done repeatedly over the last few months, just to give me his in-between lesson updates on how his serve is going. And the change was so remarkable that I actually asked him in the reply back, I said, James, do you mind if I make a YouTube video highlighting the improvements? And this was his response back. Hi, Ryan. Yes, please go ahead and make a YouTube video. I'm happy to be an example. You can even give my age, 74 next week. Happy birthday, James. I just played a little recreationally and very occasionally for my adult years and didn't get serious until 2 years ago in March, I guess with the pandemic. Then just worked by myself for a while, mainly to develop an advanced serve. And then he writes, well, my goal is to get to 100-mile-an-hour serve, which I'm going to help you with, James. Took a few lessons here and there, but your Zoom instruction and encouragement has made all the difference in the world. I guess the upside of not having played much tennis is that I don't have many bad habits. Thanks, James. James, it's such a pleasure to see the improvement, and I'm really proud of you, of the changes that you've made, and I know the sky's the limit for you. So let me walk you through what I taught James to make these changes. So first, the very first thing I look at when somebody sends me a video of their backhand or their volley or their overhead or their serve, anything technical about their, the way they swing a racket, is their grip, because the grip is what determines where the strings point, and where the strings point determines where the racket, or the body is going to face, and then that determines the way you can swing your racket. So it all hinges on the grip. So when he started with his previous serve 4 months ago, you can remember from the side-by-side comparison that he had his strings down. If you're someone, and you should be filming yourself to know what you look like, but film yourself serving and check out the way you serve. Do your strings point down at the beginning of the serve? Because if they do, there's a good chance you're using a forehand grip. So what I advise my students to do is to have the racket slightly open. That means the strings facing up slightly, not at the sky, but not on edge either, just a few degrees open. Then grab on. What you'll find most likely is that your grip feels different. You're like, oh, this isn't the grip I normally use on my serve. And that's because when you change the racket's orientation and then grab on, you're grabbing on to two different places, right? On the grip from the base knuckle and the heel pad. So we want that panel number 2 on the serve, the continental grip. The next thing we looked at with James was how high he tossed. If you're someone who notoriously has a high toss and you're like, how do I toss lower? Well, the ball is an inanimate object. It will only move if you make it move. So if the ball is going super high, it is because your arm, when tossing, is going very fast. And that gives the ball energy and the ball goes super high. So if you want to work on having a lower toss, then work on moving your arm slower. When you move your arm slower as you toss, the ball won't have the energy to go super high, and then you have a lower toss. I'll give you 3 main reasons why a lower toss is better. First, the lower the toss, typically the more consistent, because the higher it goes, the more variance kind of shows in back and forward and right and left. So you get a more consistent toss with a lower toss. The second thing it gives you is it gives you less time to swing. See, we think like, oh, I want a lot of time to swing. No, you want very little time to swing because that forces you to go fast. We want to create the environment for racket speed. We want to create the environment where a fast racket hits the ball. If James, with his old swing, tossed really high and then swung really fast, he'd swing before the ball came down. So what we have to do is get the toss to match the timing and speed of the swing. So by lowering his toss, he got to swing faster, which is a good thing. And the last reason is you get to hit a ball that's not traveling so fast as it falls. The rate of gravity, 9.8 meters per second. As that ball is descending, it's accelerating. So it's passing through the window of opportunity quickly as it descends, or quicker as it descends. So when you toss lower and you hit near the peak, maybe just a little bit after the ball begins to drop, what happens is you get to hit a ball that's not traveling so fast, so it's actually easier to hit the ball in the sweet spot. And it's actually easier to hit from a higher point too. A lot of times people toss really high and they have to wait for the ball to drop and they let it drop too low and then their arm is bent. So toss lower with a slower arm and you'll give yourself less time and an immediate impact and positive impact in how fast you can serve. All right, the next idea. When James lifted his racket up in the old swing, he would lift it up and he would activate his wrist like this. So we get into what's called wrist extension. So his wrist would start moving back and that got him into the waiter's tray position. So what I asked him to do is to lift his hand up, but keep the tip of the racket below his hand. And when he kept the tip of the racket below his hand, keeping his palm down, it kept the racket on the front side of his hand rather than so quickly flipping the racket over like he's a waiter in a restaurant putting down glasses of water. So what I want you to do is try lifting your racket up. Shout out to Jim Klein, Doylestown Tennis Club. Is try to feel like you have like what's called the goose, right? Where it's curled over like a little goose head, right? So as you lift your hand, let the racket lag a little bit and trail a little bit. You could think of it as lead up with your wristband, whatever you have to think of. By making this move and keeping the strings facing down, that's what then prepares us for making this circular motion that is going to give us a lot of racket speed. What you don't want is to let the racket just flip over the hand. I'll show it from this angle. You don't want to go like this and then just flip. If you're someone who makes that flipping motion, you're making that laid back motion in the wrist. You want to learn to lift with the wrist only, feeling like the racket's just down. It's not an active flexing of the wrist, where wrist flexion, you're not actively flexing. You're just allowing the weight of the racket to curl the wrist over as you lift the racket up. But this sets us up for knocking off the party hat. So there are 2 ways you can really think of this. And I'm going to get a tennis ball here to actually demonstrate this as well. I think I just hit my microphone against a chair right there. I apologize if that just made some noise. So what we want to do is we want to learn to make this move where the racket is circular. I call it like the lasso, where the racket makes a lasso move around your head. That produces 360 degrees of racket movement and acceleration. So another way to do it, and wear a birthday hat when you do this, but you can also practice it with a ball in the throat of the racket. And your goal is to make this move. Now,
One of the things you'll see with James is he doesn't have a really deep racket drop. He's just learning. And again, there are things that I saw in that new video that I will be discussing with James. But this is all about highlighting really, the positives. Yes, by practicing this, you might notice that you don't have a super low racket drop. That's okay, because the benefit that comes from this, and then you'll get the racket drop later on, is well worth it. I want you to practice with a ball in the throat, drawing 360 degrees without letting the ball fall out. Where if you do what James typically did, or what he used to do 4 months ago, where the racket opened up, and he's not going to do that anymore because his new serve is etched in his brain and he knows what to do now. If you do this, the ball falls out if you lay it open. But if you keep the ball in the throat of the racket and you learn this move, that's going to help you to bring the racket around, which is going to allow you to accelerate into the ball with pronation. Now, what we saw as he was coming around was his racket in this position. In fact, let me show you John Isner in this exact position, because a lot of people think, are you sure it's supposed to be like this? Let me show you Isner serving with this exact technique.
Now, first, I just want to say that this video is courtesy of Ian over at Essential Tennis. So thank you so much, Ian. Make sure you subscribe to their awesome channel. I'll put their link in the description below. All right. Isner serve, the gigantic Isner serve. All right. And this has nothing to do with being super tall. I want you to look at his racket. Notice his strings right now are pointing down. It actually looks like he's going to use the back side of the racket to hit the ball. And then this is exactly what we saw with James. Then he starts to pronate. You can see his strings are now facing off to the side. Now his strings are facing up to the left. And now he hits the ball. And you can see how he has, of course, the racket to the inside of his hand. That's exactly what we were talking about with James. And here's the continued pronation. So now his strings are facing off to the right. In fact, his strings face even more. But this idea that the racket, when it comes around, you could actually practice using the back side of the racket as a way to get into this position and then learn to pronate right at the very end in order to accelerate and hit big serves is absolutely going to help you.
So one of the drills I gave James to practice this position, rather than the waiter's tray and flipping the racket and the strings face up, what I asked him to do was to come around with his racket strings facing down. I'm going to kneel so I don't hit the ceiling here, and I'm going to hit a foam ball into the wall here. What I actually asked him to practice was to hit the back side of the strings rather than the strings that you would normally use on a serve, which is what he was doing with opening up. He had the forehand grip, his strings were facing up, and he's making this move. What I actually wanted him to learn was how to come around with the racket slightly closed, like we just saw with Isner, and then that would allow him to then pronate into the contact. Well, one of the drills you can do is actually just to practice hitting serves with the back of your racket. And this is what he did in order to learn how to come around with your strings closed. Remember, if I'm right here, I could go up and hit the back side of the strings, which I don't want you to actually do. It's just a way of learning this position. Or you can do what James did and what we saw with Isner, is the racket comes up and then you turn at the last second. And when you make that last second turn, it's like an accelerant. You really get to accelerate the racket. So then the goal is to kind of fool the ball, make the ball think you're going to hit the backside of the strings, and then as you get closer to it, you quick turn, which is what I'll demonstrate right now. And it's what we saw. I'm not going to serve super fast, but I'm trying to make it look like I'm going to hit the backside of the strings, and then I turn at the last second. That's what we saw with Isner. It's what we saw with James. Now, I want to clarify one thing. This is how, and I've got the Topspin Pro arm that I just took off the actual Topspin Pro so we can practice the serve here. You can hit side spin when you pronate. The goal is that as you're coming up, your racket's on edge, you're turning the forearm, but you spin the ball, and then as a righty, your strings face off to the right. So you can hit the normal side spin on the ball, and the ball will curve left. So you want to learn that side spin, but you want to learn the acceleration that comes from pronation, which is why we want to have the continental grip, which is why we want the strings to face down when it comes around. That way we kind of force ourselves and put ourselves in the right position to hit the pronation and the exact serve that we're looking for. James, I'm so proud of you. I want to thank you for trusting me to help you with your game. I know we've only gotten started, and we're going to keep going, and we're going to keep improving your serve. And if you would like, as the viewer, if you would like me to personally fix your technique, it could be on your serve, your backhand, your forehand, any of your strokes, your return of serve, whatever it is that you're struggling with, Or it could be your match play. Record yourself playing a doubles match or a singles match and send me the video, and we'll meet live on Zoom. And I will show you everything from court positioning to shot selection to playing offense and defense and how to win no matter which situation, offense and defense, you're in, which you absolutely can. If you would like me to help you with your tennis game personally, go to 2minutetennis.net and sign up for a private live Zoom lesson. It would be an honor to help you play your best tennis. So work on what you just saw that I taught James. Work on the open racket face and that lower toss. And this drill is changing people's serves, working on hitting the backside of the strings and then learning at the last second to pronate. Work on with your serve what you just learned with James and sign up for a Zoom private lesson. And if you do, there's no doubt you're going to gain confidence, win more matches, and play much better tennis. This is Ryan Reedy from 2minutetennis.net. James, you got this.